Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another Reading Roundtable. I'm Dave Toy, the instructor for the course, and I'm joined today by Dave Peloff from the Center for Technology and Education, and who is a former instructor of this course. So I'm thrilled to have him here, and he's going to help us unpack some of these complicated articles. But today we're going to be focusing on Bogost. And before we do that, Dave, is there anything I forgot to put on your CV?
Oh, no, not really. I've been at Hopkins for a long time, 20 plus years, taught several courses, but I think this is one of the more fun courses to teach. So yeah, I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for all your work and helping get all of this course together. We really appreciate it. It's been a great process. So Bogost, right? This is one of the denser articles in the course. There's a lot going on here. There's some really fundamental stuff that we got to kind of unpack here, because without understanding some of this foundational stuff, it's hard to get into a bit more of the nitty gritty and understand how these things are implied, some of the applications of some of these things. So yeah, let's kind of dig right in here. And, so Dave, in your own words, how would you understand Bogost's construction of a procedural system?
So first of all, I will say that I'm not, when I taught the course, I'm not that wrapped up in definitions too much. I think it's important to understand the concepts behind the words, but there's a lot of overlap in this stuff. But I think the point he's trying to make is that the most basic function of a computer or a piece of software or a video game, it's a set of mechanical instructions. It tells the device, the computer, the video game platform, whatever it is, what to do. So, if you think of a computer, the most basic part of a computer is the processor. So it's a series of instructions that tell the computer what to do. But, that's a very dry and cold sort of definition. But what you do with those instructions is you create models of reality and some models that mimic some part of the real world. And that's where you start using those models to interrogate through games, simulations. And so I think that's what he's trying to get at, is that just this pure role of computer instructions lead to models, which then those models can be used for many purposes.
And I talked a little bit about this with Jim, and the idea is that so much of this stuff is about getting down to the core. The atomized was the word he used, to understand the smallest components of something, and then you can build out from there. So really, in this argument structure, this really is the smallest components. The instruction is the smallest component we can kind of get to in that moment.
Yeah, I think that's right. And another point that Bogost makes is that anything like let's say Microsoft Word, that has a series of procedures too, but those are designed more as open-ended tools. In most cases, games have a much more direct purpose or specific purpose. There can be a lot of flexibility within that, but they're a system of instructions that are designed for a specific purpose. Is how I would differentiate that from other types of computer procedures.
No, that's great. That's great. And that's really helpful to understand, because it's really important at the essence of the game to really, when you're starting that initial process, to really define that, be clear about that, and then kind of follow that down the road. If you have bad instructions that take you somewhere afield, you're not going to have the game that you want, or not have the kind of game experience. So it's important to envision that at the outset of the process. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, so then, he kind of unpacks, kind of on page 123, this notion of rhetoric. And this is kind of one of those big terms that we hear a lot in grad school. And let's just real quick, in the Bogostian mindset, what's he talking about when he's talking about rhetoric?
He does a really good job, I think, of describing how the term has changed over time and how it has actually different meanings, including in today's world. Rhetoric is often associated with, the Western expression "hot air," meaning it's words that don't particularly have much meaning. So it almost has become pejorative. But in the strictest definition, I think rhetoric means persuasive speech.
Hmm.
So it's a way of using language to make an argument or a claim about the world.
Hmm.
Now he talks about all different types of rhetoric, visual rhetoric, if you make a film or a painting, you're trying to instill some feeling in the person who's seeing it,
Yeah.
who's experiencing it. So that's one type of rhetoric. If you're making an argument about public policy, you want someone to believe that we should have more funding for early childhood education. That could be a form of kind of community rhetoric or political rhetoric.
Hmm.
But it really, I think he's trying to make the argument or the idea that rhetoric it's a way of convincing someone of something, or at least expressing your point of view, even if you're not
Hmm.
trying to convince them.
Yep, absolutely. And what's so great about that is that this is really where we kind of get into this notion of point of view. And people might not think about that when I play a video game, a first-person shooter or some kind of Tetris or something like that. Well, what's the point of view? Where's the game designer coming from? And the reality is they do have a point of view. They do have a perspective that they're trying to share, especially when you start seeing, these very episodic, multi-dimensional games where there's a lot of story going on. I guarantee you the game designer has a lot of strong point of view because it took them a long time to get to that point. So, the narrative really, and the narrative and the point of view really kind of intersect in a way and interlock so that one kind of informs the other. And,
Yeah,
no,
that's true. And I think sometimes it's pretty obvious what the point of view is of a particular game, but sometimes it's much more subtle.
Mhm.
It may be, if you think about someone creating a model of something, let's say it's a model of an airplane or a spaceship, or no computer model can be completely accurate. So there's going to be choices made about what things to include and what things to not include.
Yes.
And those choices sometimes have a meaning, or they suggest a meaning, even if the author didn't intend it.
Yes.
So it may be the things that they focus on in their model are the things they find most important, even if they don't realize it, while leaving out some things that are actually critical that they give very little attention to. So
Yeah.
sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's very overt.
Yeah. And this is nice because this dovetails really nicely into now we're going to combine that procedure out and that rhetoric together. But, in that example you gave, of a spaceship, right? We can take a perspective of what's it like to operationally run the spaceship, to train someone on how to use the instrumentation of the spaceship. We could talk about the physics of the spaceship. We could talk about how aerodynamics work. We could talk about the economic models of building the spaceship or launching the spaceship, or how many people would you put in the spaceship, right?
Yeah.
So let's
Or
now
why build a spaceship at all?
Oh, right. Why build the spaceship at all? Right. Exactly. So, let's put these two together. Let's talk about this procedural rhetoric, and I think this is a really nice dovetail into that. So, you know, you've been teaching. You taught this course before. How do you tend to approach this procedural rhetoric?
Well, we've hit on some of it already. I think some games are very specific in requiring a player to make ethical or moral decisions. Sometimes that's a very clear, straightforward statement. It's a point of view that the game has. The article talks about that McDonald's game where, they're very, very clearly trying to make some social statements about the ethics of, factory farming and fast food.
Yeah.
But again, sometimes it's not quite so specific. It may just be that there's some implicit bias in the experience that
Hmm.
that turns out to make a statement, whether the game designer realized it or not. I mean, the big example that you read in a lot of these articles is Grand Theft Auto. You and I have talked about that before. I admit I've played and enjoyed that game tremendously at times, but mostly as a driving simulator. I just love
Mhm.
driving around the city. It's fun. The cars
Mhm.
feel differently. They handle differently in different weather or different streets or elevation, speed, type of vehicle, and that can be fun. But at the same time, there's all kinds of messages in that game and the game design and the choices the players made that are showing a lot of bias and prejudice and actually racism and a lot of the character, the way they just portray the characters and their decisions and their stories. Some of it, I think, is supposed to be ironic and not that they're condoning it. Other times, it's probably very just blatantly uncool. So procedural rhetoric, I think it's just putting together this idea of there's a system or a game, simulation, or it could be a movie, a painting, a piece of literature, something that has a model to it, but that makes some kind of statement about the world.
And I think one of the things that's really interesting in what you just said is that there's also what the designer chooses to include and also what they choose to leave out, right? By not saying something, that's making a statement too. And, Grand Theft Auto being an example of that, I just read an interview with one of the designers for that, and that was based on Pac-Man. It's really, when you look actually the way it's going around, he envisioned, the Pac-Man character as the car driver and the pedestrians as dots. That says something right there, right? Because in Pac-Man, the Pac-Man character is consuming the dots. So, take that as you will. And then the ghosts are the police. And that style of thinking, that's a worldview that the game designer had at the essence of it. And then they built layers of layers and layers and layers on top of that until they had expressed a point of view about a city in the 20th century, looking very different from the initial iteration of that game. And that's a perspective. And the inherent violence in that game and the inherent actions that you're called to do as the lead character is a reflection of the values of the designer, what they thought was important to include or not include.
Yeah. And you can imagine maybe taking that same exact setting, graphics, game mechanics, and have a completely different story and perspective. What if it was about potentially systemic racism and inner city police departments?
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's all about, as you said, the perspective of the designer in many cases.